Okay, my name is Dennis Gill, the Americans in Wartime Museum. Today's date is 18 May 2019, and I'm conducting an interview with Dana Barclay, and we are at the 2019 Warbirds Over the Beach in Virginia Beach, Virginia. Sir, if you could tell us your name, what year you were born, and where were you born?
Okay, my name is Dana David Barclay, and I don't know if you want me to look at you or the camera or just you.
Yeah.
Okay. I was born in Providence, Rhode Island in December 17th, 1947, which also happens to be the anniversary of the first flight by the Wright brothers in 1903. I wasn't there, but the date is my birth date, ironically enough. And the year that I was born was the year that Chuck Yeager broke the sound barrier. So maybe there's some destiny there.
Maybe.
You know, born to fly airplanes and fast airplanes, which I ended up doing for a good part of my 21-year career.
Yeah. What branch of service were you in?
United States Navy.
United States Navy?
Yeah.
And what wars or conflicts did you participate in directly?
The combat that I actually saw where I got shot at and got to probably kill some bad guys was Grenada and also Lebanon, supporting the Marines in Lebanon in 83, 84 when they were part of the multinational forces. They were in Lebanon in 83, 84. I graduated from the University of Rhode Island in 1970, and believe it or not, I was a botany major and a chemistry minor. And if that sounds kind of weird relative to what I did for most of my career,
Right.
I was going to be an oceanographer. So instead of being tired of school and tired of being broke and given an opportunity to fly go-fast machines off aircraft carriers, I decided to come in the Navy. I had a high lottery number. I never would have been drafted. And so consequently, I went through AOCS Pensacola, Florida, Aviation Officer Candidate School in Pensacola, Florida, which was largely depicted in the movie in the early 80s, The Officer and a Gentleman. And we had 17 weeks of Marine drill instructors. I did really well in that, and in the training command I did real well, and I had high grades and I had really good class standing. And when I came into the Navy, all I wanted to fly was fighters. As the shirt I'm wearing today, F-4 Phantom, it's all I wanted to fly. And then later on in my career, I flew Tomcats. So I proceeded to go through the training command, got my wings in July of 1971. I came in July of 1970. I got my commission late October in 70, and I proceeded to go advanced training. I selected for Phantoms, and Vietnam was going on at the time, and I really wanted to go to Vietnam because you're young and crazy and trained to do those kind of things. And so consequently, all of us wanted to go to Vietnam, but there were only so many sets of orders going to squadrons that ultimately would be going to Vietnam, and I didn't get selected for one of those squadrons, or coasts in actuality. It was the East Coast and the West Coast. Some East Coast squadrons late in the Vietnam War were still going to Vietnam, but most of them were going to Vietnam from West Coast squadrons.
Right.
So I went to my advanced training in Phantoms out of the East Coast, which has got me to Virginia Beach, which is where I live a good portion of the year still now. I spent most of my career in Virginia Beach when I was not on deployment. I made 6 major deployments. I made 4 on the USS Independence, CV-62, and I made 2 on the USS Eisenhower. The combat that I actually did see, not seeing Vietnam, in 1983, we went down to Grenada at the request of the Organization of the Eastern Caribbean States to President Reagan when there was a coup in Grenada, and we went down there to dispatch the bad guys. That also had to do with a medical university that was taken over by the bad guys down there who had overthrown the government. And we were down there to not only give it back to the legitimate government, but also to take care of the hostages there. Consequently, and we were scheduled to go on a normal Mediterranean deployment.
Right.
We flew aboard the ship the day after the ship pulled out, or the same day the ship pulled out of Norfolk. And the next day when the sun came up, instead of the sun coming up over the bow, which I fully expected, the sun came up over the port side, which told me very quickly, gee, we're not going east, we're going south. And this is basically how we found out we were going to Grenada to perform that operation. We were actually only down there a few days. We did encounter some opposition from Grenadian troops and Cuban troops. Did get shot at, responded with the Tomcats we were flying with 20 millimeter Gatling gun ammunition, which is very, very effective against those kind of weapons. Did some strafing, and that's the first time in my life that I've ever been shot at in combat, and it gets your attention. You're not really sure how you're going to respond, how you're going to react, etc. Prior to that, I actually had an even more exciting experience, very unique experience in the squadron that I was in. I was in Fighter Squadron 32 at the time, and in August of 1983, August 21st, 1983, the guy that I was flying with and we were doing routine trading leading up to this extended deployment. We were down in the Caribbean op area, and we ended up having an engine fire not too long after takeoff, and it was at night. It was about 8:20 in the evening, East Coast time, Caribbean time. And so, make a long story short, we ended up saving the aircraft by landing an F-14 Tomcat aboard an aircraft carrier at night, single engine, because we did shut the bad engine down, but we were still on fire. And you can actually see the video of it on YouTube, because all landings and takeoffs and flight deck operations are always recorded, primarily for accident reconstruction purposes. So that was actually more exciting than being shot at in combat, because you're on your own and your airplane's on fire and it's got gas in it and bad things can happen. So we were down in Grenada, and there were a lot of interesting things about that operation. It was a very short notice operation. It was not particularly well coordinated, to be totally honest. All of the services participated because it was the first real action that the United States had been associated with basically since Vietnam and a couple of other small skirmishes here and there. And so everybody, all the services wanted a piece of the action, and that was part of the problem. And unfortunately, it did get some guys killed because it was poorly planned, not really super well coordinated. And that's not to put a negative light on it, but that's just that's largely the part of war anyway, particularly when there's short notice, when any kind of combat at all. And so, but we were very successful. We restored the legitimate government, and we liberated, the students were ultimately liberated from the medical facility where they were incarcerated by the locals and the Cubans and the Grenadians, etc. We proceeded from there to the Mediterranean, which was our original plan, and we were going to the Eastern Mediterranean to support the Marines that were positioned. They were part of the multinational peacekeeping force there at the time, and we got there probably a couple of 3 weeks after the Marine barracks was destroyed there by terrorists. And so consequently, we arrived on scene there shortly after that, and for the next several months we supported the Marines over there with armed reconnaissance, and the squadron that I was in actually carried some of the aircraft that were capable of carrying external reconnaissance pods for photographic imagery and this, that, and the other thing. And of course, when you fly over doing that, the bad guys are going to see it, and they're going to not be happy with that, and they're going to shoot at you. And they shot at us with some pretty good sized weapons, 57 millimeter, 20 millimeter, which is not real big, and larger than I can't recall the caliber right now, but 57 is pretty large. And the first time I encountered flak, which is just like you see in World War II movies, and with explosions occurring near aircraft, and when you're flying over a bad guy territory, it's just like in a movie. And that was my first reaction to it, seeing it. It's like, wow, this is cool. This is just like just like the movies. Only the problem is, if it hits you, it's not going to be like the movies. You're gonna be just toast. We were flying about 600 miles an hour at about 3,000 feet. Unfortunately, right in the small arms envelope, and right in the envelope where these guns were zeroed in. And so just by good fortune, and also the fact that they didn't know when we were coming, because we used certain tactics that I won't divulge, that kind of masked what we did when we did it. And so consequently, it was a surprise to them every time we did it. And also, as a consequence, while I didn't get any direct kills there, while we were flying these missions, it was usually the USS New Jersey, with their 16-inch guns, main guns, that was right off the coast, and some smaller ships as well. And when we started taking fire, we would just announce where we're taking fire from. Hamana Biskinta, Souk El Garb, whatever.
Right.
Basically, everybody over there with a gun shot at us, except the Christians and the Marines. I don't think the Marines shot at us. You never know with Marines. You never know. No, they didn't shoot. They're great guys, and I love Marines. But anyway, so when we would announce that we were taking fire from a certain area on a mission, the individual in charge of the mission would pronounce on the radio, "Roger that. Just report feet wet," which means when you're back over the water, tell us you're back over the water, because at that time we'll know that you are clear of where our ammunition that we fire from our guns is going to be going through.
Okay.
So consequently, we reported feet wet. USS New Jersey swung their 16-inch guns around and cut loose, and a 16-inch gun fires a shell that's about 2,400 pounds. It'll make a hole the size of a football field, essentially. And so I didn't get any direct kills there, but I get a lot of nice assists. And I slept like a baby every night. Didn't bother me at all. They're going to shoot at me. I'm going to respond in kind. So we did that for several months, and they did fire some missiles at us as well. They had shoulder launched missiles, and they did have some bigger missiles than that. But I didn't get shot with any of the bigger missiles, and I don't think any of my squadron mates did either. The only other I had a couple of other close combat experiences in my career. They were earlier in my career when I was flying Phantoms, not when I was flying Tomcats. And in the early 70s, when I was first in my first squadron, Fighter Squadron 33, which I'm wearing one of the hats from right now, we were assigned to do what was called hot pad duty at that time. And the purpose of that was down at Key West, and that's when we had reconnaissance aircraft, high-speed reconnaissance aircraft, primarily RA-5C Vigilantes, which is a beautiful aircraft, very, very fast, flying over Cuba and doing reconnaissance. And whenever the Vigis would fly over Cuba doing their missions, we were in our aircraft, ready to go, ready to crank up and scramble if the Cubans set up some mids or whatever to try to shoot down the Vigis. And so, and we were loaded to the teeth. 2 Sparrow missiles, 2 Sidewinder missiles, and 2 Zuni pods, which is a very large rocket pod. And we never got a hot scramble where they actually did come up, but we had a couple of practice scrambles, and that was always fun to do. The only other time that I was down there where to oppose Cuban operations was during the Mariel boat crisis, when a lot of, basically Castro was allowing a lot of the boat people to come to the U.S. during the Carter administration, was in 1980. And we got some intel, or the government got some intel somehow, that Castro was going to try to embarrass the U.S. on Independence Day in 1980 by dumping 5,000 of these refugees on our shores right on Independence Day. And so I was an instructor in Phantoms in the early 80s at the time, right in Virginia Beach at the base here, the Phantoms training squadron. And so they were looking for folks who wanted to spend their 4th of July weekend in Key West. And I happened to be married at the time, and so I told my wife at the time, I'm being ordered to go to Key West to do this mission because we figured if Castro sent the ship out, then we were going to send the Coast Guard to intercept it and turn it around. And we figured that the Cubans would send up MiGs to oppose the Coast Guard, and we would have to have somebody on station there to oppose the MiGs. So anyway, that was what I was ordered to do. In actuality, I volunteered to do it. What self-respecting fighter pilot would not do that? But anyway, so went down there, and we were loaded to the teeth for that one as well. The ship did come out, and it was, as I recall, the name of the ship was the Purple Flame. Might have been just a code name. And it did come out, and it was intercepted by the Coast Guard. The MiGs did not come up, so we didn't have to intercept them. And as it turned out, the ship was empty. So Castro blinked, effectively. The only other significant, memorable experience that I can recall that could have been end up combat related, was during the Yom Kippur War, near the end of it, when Henry Kissinger, who was Secretary of State at the time, was doing his shuttle diplomacy in the Middle East, hopscotching around trying to get everybody to kind of have a ceasefire at least, or what have you. It was a pretty big conflict. When he was essentially ready for the purpose for which he went over there, it was time to him to fly back in the States. And we were on alert on the USS Independence almost constantly during that, because we intercepted many, many Russian transport aircraft, because they were supplying the Egyptians and the other bad guys opposing Israel during the Yom Kippur War. So we intercepted a ton of those all the time. But then, so we were in alert status all the time, 5-minute alert, 15-minute alert, 30-minute alert, whatever. And when you're in 5-minute alert, you're actually in the aircraft. It's armed. It's loaded with missiles. That time it was just missiles for us. It wasn't bombs. It wasn't rockets, because who you're going to be opposing is going to be other aircraft. It's not going to be anything on the ground. So you don't need bombs or rockets. So consequently, I was on 5-minute alert at that time, and we got the call, launched the Alert 5. So it was four different aircraft. My aircraft, another aircraft from my squadron, 2 aircraft from VF-1 and 2, our sister squadron, and our initial vector was 090, which means we're going east. And the USS Independence at that time was orbiting south of Crete. That was our assigned position. So we headed east, and we did air-to-air refueling in a route. It was going to be a long mission, and we basically, at some point in time, not too long after we hit the tanker, were given a clearance to fire on anything that threatened Secretary Kissinger's aircraft. And so we tuned up our missiles. They all tuned. They're all ready to go. My fangs came out, and they did actually get some high-speed contacts coming out of Egypt. And I was thinking to myself, now's going to be time. I'm going to really get some good action. And there were probably MiGs coming out of Egypt, and we had a clearance to fire in the event they got close enough. But unfortunately for me, they turned around and went home. We ended up picking up Secretary Kissinger. It was just after dark. I don't recall the day. It was October sometime in 1973. I forget the exact date. I could check my logbook. I could figure it out. It was probably the 3rd week of the Yom Kippur War. And picked him up about 90 miles off of Tel Aviv or Haifa. I think it was probably Tel Aviv. The Israelis, as I recall, escorted him out to that point. We intercepted him, we picked him up, and we escorted him to about 200 miles west of Crete. We had to do in-flight refueling again on the way back from a tanker that was sent out to us, and then we had to refuel again before we ultimately landed on the ship. So that was probably the longest mission I ever flew in a Phantom, and one of the times that I came closest to really enjoyable combat. I would have really enjoyed it. As crazy as that sounds to most people, that's what you train for, that's what you signed up for, that's what you really want to do. It's the ultimate that you can do as a fighter pilot. So those are essentially my biggest experience, most interesting experiences in the years that I flew fighters for the Navy.
Let me ask you, let's back up just a little bit. I'm going to
Sure.
dial down a few details. Did you have anybody else in your family that was military? Dad or brothers?
My dad was in the Navy in World War II. He was actually on escort destroyers in the Atlantic. And he was a 3rd-class sonar man looking for submarines, because that was the task of his ship and the groups that his ship was working with. He did see some action in World War II in the North Atlantic. One time he was in company with the USS Fisk, which was another ship, escort destroyer like his.
Right.
And they were escorting a convoy with what's called a killer group, which was a small aircraft carrier with aircraft on it. Their purpose was to look for and to sink German submarines and to prevent them from intercepting the convoy. And during one of the operations, this was in, I believe, August of 1944. He was a sonar man, and he got a contact on a submarine, and so they pursued the submarine. And during that pursuit, the submarine came up to torpedo depth and actually torpedoed his sister ship, the USS Fixed. The ship did sink, and about a fifth of the crew were killed in that action. And I actually have photographs of that because I did some research on it, and I found aerial photographs taken by maritime patrol aircraft who happened to be in the area at the time. And you can see my dad's ship and the USS Fisk in a search pattern looking for the submarine. You can't tell which ship is which because they both look the same. And the quality, the resolution of it wasn't close enough to it. You could check the hull number. But my dad actually used to tell me about seeing carrier qualifications on the carriers when he was in company with the carriers. And when I decided to come in the Navy and fly airplanes, he only said two things to me because it was during Vietnam, and he said, "You know, the other guys get to shoot back." And I said, "Yeah, Dad, I know." And he said, "You remember those stories I used to tell you all the time about carrier qualifications and planes crashing on the ship and pilots getting killed?" I said, "Yeah, Dad, I remember." In other words, I knew what I was signing up for. I knew it was hazardous business. And the other thing that confirmed it, I actually had, you talk about relatives, in addition to my dad, I actually had two second cousins in World War II. They were both Navy pilots. One flew PBY Catalinas in the Pacific, and the other one flew FM2 Wildcats, which was a more advanced version of the Wildcat. It had a bigger engine and it had a bigger rudder for it, and he got killed in the Battle of Okinawa. Both of them got killed, and I know it worried my poor mom sick. But she never said a word, but I know it worried her sick, because I signed up for a hazardous business, risky business, but I knew what I was signing up for. And not to dwell on the negative, but in my 21-year career in the Navy, 18 of which was flying airplanes, I lost almost 50 friends of mine. And none of those were combat losses. Those were all accidents. It was a risky business. It's not as risky anymore. In those times and earlier times, it was a lot more risky.
See, you wanted to fly.
Yes.
Why did you pick the Navy as opposed to the Air Force? Or
my dad was in the Navy, and that was probably a big factor. The Navy gets all the pretty girls, so I was told, and I'm probably partially right. I liked that service, and I'll be totally honest. If you'd like to know how I came in the Navy and flew airplanes, you're not going to believe the story, but it's true. I was a junior in college. I was a botany major in college. I was a chemistry minor. I was going to be an oceanographer. This guy on TV, Jacques Cousteau, looked like he was having a lot of fun. And he was an old guy. I figured, this guy's not going to be around forever. I'm going to be the next Jacques Cousteau. And so the recruiters were on campus at this time, and it was in the fall of would have been 1968, my junior year, fall semester. So I went up to the student union where the recruiters were with the intention of talking to the surface Navy guy, not the aviators. I never have been in an airplane before in my life, not even an airliner at that time. And so I came up to him with my plan, and he said, "Good afternoon, young man. How are you doing? Can I help you with anything? Are you interested in coming in the Navy?" And I said, "As a matter of fact, I am." I said, "The Navy has oceanographers, don't they?" And he said, "Well, yeah, we kind of do, but not a lot. We don't do a whole lot of that." And I said, "Well, I'm a botany major, a chemistry minor, and I'd like to be an oceanographer. And so how about the idea of coming into the Navy and being an oceanographer in the Navy?" And I'm thinking, then I get out and I become the next Jacques Cousteau. So that's what's kind of my plan. He says, well, he he was not a really good recruiter, because instead of saying, young man, that's a fantastic idea, sign here,
Right.
and we'll start you taking tests, and then before you know it, I'm in the Navy, and I'm probably not going to be an oceanographer. But anyway, so he says, well, we don't really do much in oceanography and this, that, and the other thing. And so I said, well, thank you for your time. And I'm walking away. I'm walking by the next table where you got two newly winged naval aviators in their uniforms, and they're shooting their watches like pilots have the tendency to do, like they're dogfighting and stuff. And they're really upbeat guys. They're really good recruiters. And they say, good afternoon, young man. How are you today? I said, I'm doing pretty good. How are you doing? And they say, do you ever think about flying airplanes? And they literally had a poster, a recruiting poster, right behind them of a Phantom, which I knew about. It was a bad airplane. Right behind them, getting ready to be launched off on a catapult, off an aircraft carrier. Really, really great picture.
Right.
And so they say, you ever think about flying airplanes? Nope. You ever been in an airplane? Nope. And they said, well, come in the upcoming holiday break, why don't you come up to South Weymouth Naval Air Station, which was only about 40 minutes from my house where I grew up in Rhode Island.
Right.
And they said, you can take the written test. We'll have you take the written test, see if you qualify for aviation. And if you do, well, even if whether you do or you don't, we'll take you flying. We'll take you up on an airplane. And I said, that sounds good.
Yeah.
And here's my name, and where do I go, and when do you want me there, and etc. And then I literally said, and if I qualify, can I fly those? And I pointed right to the poster with the Phantom. And of course, them being good recruiters said, of course. That's all I wanted to fly was fighters. Once I get in, all I wanted to fly was fighters. And I flew Phantoms for several years. I got about 1,500 hours in Phantoms. And then later on in my career, I transitioned to Tomcats, and I got about 800 hours in Tomcats.
Now, do you have a choice in what you fly?
No, it's all your ranking in your class.
Okay.
The better grades you get, pretty much the top guys get fighters. Even though guys fly other airplanes, and they always say they love the aircraft that they were flying, and they probably do.
Yeah.
But deep down in every pilot's heart, military pilot's heart, they want to fly fighters. They really want to fly fighters.
Right.
And nobody is going to insult you by calling you a fighter puke or just a fighter pilot, whatever. That's a challenge of honor.
Right.
That's a name of honor. I said, yeah, I am. I'm a fighter puke. and your point is?
Right.
But anyway, so that's kind of the way that goes.
What was training like? You said you never flown before.
Never flown before.
Now you get commissioned and you're training. What's that like? How extensive is it?
Well, in actuality, the Navy took me flying when I was being recruited. And the recruiting process is very, very long. This was in the fall of 1968.
Okay.
And I mean, you have multiple tests. You got a written test, which is basically an aptitude test.
Yeah.
And then you do a physical, which is really important. And you have to pass that. And then you go through multiple interviews, and you fill out reams of paperwork. You have to have multiple references. They talk to your neighbors. They talk to your relatives. It's extremely lengthy. And then the program that I went through was depicted in the movie Officer and a Gentleman. At that time, it was 17 weeks when I went through it. It was Pensacola, Florida. And we had Marine drill instructors for 17 weeks.
Wow.
My class started off with 56 guys. Only 26 of us got our commission, and of those 26, only 15 of us got our wings. And that was during Vietnam. There was a war on. They needed bodies.
Yeah.
But they made it extremely hard for you to make it through, because they're not going to give the keys to a Phantom, or they didn't have Tomcats at that time, to just anybody. No matter how much you wanted to fly them, they're not going to give it to anybody. So guys have tried it for a lot of different reasons.
Right.
And they made it very easy for you to quit. They made it difficult for you to make it through. You could quit up to the point basically where you got your commission. After you got your commission, if you DOR, drop on request, which is depicted in the movie, if you were commissioned, you kind of had a couple of options. Usually they could send you home and you'd be done, or you'd become a ship driver.
Right.
And so there's nothing wrong with that, but only went in to fly not only airplanes, but I wanted to fly fighters. The training is very, very extensive. The training is phenomenal. Because to land on an aircraft carrier, I mean, Air Force pilots are really, really good pilots, particularly if they're flying fighters, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But the difference between that and landing on a carrier is night and day. Their runway is going to be exactly where they left it when they took off.
Right.
And it's probably going to be anywhere from 8,000 to 12,000 feet long. All right?
It won't be moving.
And it won't be moving. And ours is not going to be in the same location where we took off. We have to find it. And it's a very short runway. An aircraft carrier looks huge when you walk up next to it or when you're on it. When you have to land on it, it looks tiny.
Yeah.
It looks tiny. But there are certain things that you have to do to help you land, and there's visual cues that you're paying attention to, and you practice, and you practice, and you practice. I've got almost 600 total carrier landings, actual carrier landings, almost 200 of them at night. And the amount of practice landings that you do, every landing that you do at a base, particularly your home base, and you actually do practice carrier landings intentionally besides, it's called bouncing, a bounce flight. They're all just like you're going to land on a carrier. You do it exactly the same way. You're using the same visual cues that are set up next to the runway and also the practice runway when you're doing it. So while I've got almost 600 actual carrier landings, I probably have at least that, if not 1,000, or maybe 2,000 practice carrier landings. Because every landing that you make at the field, you're landing like you're landing on a carrier. You don't flare it in close like the Air Force does. You do that on a carrier with an arrested landing, you can have what's called an in-flight engagement, and that's going to bring your aircraft crashing to the deck, probably driving the main mounts right through the wings and destroying the aircraft, and the aircraft's probably going to come apart, it's going to explode, and you're going to die.
Right.
So you don't land like that, like you do, like the Air Force would land at a field, or like an airliner would land at a field.
Yeah.
They actually flare their landing so it's smooth. So if you're on an airliner and the landing feels like a controlled crash, probably the guy up front was a former Navy pilot. Because literally, that's what it is. It's described, a carrier landing is like a controlled crash, because you fly it literally all the way to touchdown. You do not flare it. So Navy aircraft are actually built with a ruggedness much better than the Air Force are. Even though the Air Force flew Phantoms, the Navy flew Phantoms, the Marine Corps flew Phantoms, a lot of countries in the world flew Phantoms. Navy Phantoms, because since they had to land on ships, were built much more ruggedly than the Air Force ones were. So
you've got lots of training,
right,
and practice landing on a carrier.
Yep.
So what's it like the first time you actually do it?
You feel like you are so far behind the airplane, and you don't want to be behind your airplane. You want to be ahead of your airplane, because you know what you have to do, you know what has to be done, but you feel like you're constantly playing catch up. And you're going through your head 1,000 times, all the checklist, the landing checklist, and looking for all the cues and everything else. And there are guys on the ship talking to you, and the landing signal officers talking to you, and the whole thing, and directing you. And there's lots of people out there helping you.
Right.
And you don't really realize, you know that they're helping you, but I won't use the phrase that we used to use, how busy you could be before, but you probably recall it. Busier than an impaired paper hanger. Let's put it that way. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like he's got an artificial arm, or maybe no arms, or whatever. That's how busy you feel. You really feel busy. But as time goes on, you get used to it. But just to kind of go back a little bit. So when I started AOCS July 7th, 1970, in Pensacola, Florida, it is miserable. There's no worse time to be in Pensacola, Florida than the summertime. It's hot, it's humid. You got Marine drill instructors screaming at you, almost constantly. And so 17 weeks of that, about the last 5 weeks, they pretty much left you alone, because you're a senior candidate. You're still living in the battalions. You're not commissioned yet, but you're actually going to your first training squadron, which to me it was Training Squadron 10. And I got to VT 10. Would have been September, late September of 1970. We're taking incoming fire here, so my combat paycheck should be showing up not too long down the road. There he goes again. Incoming! No, that's outgoing, so we don't have to worry about that. But anyway, for those of you who are going to watch this video, that's actually a German 88 NA aircraft gun that they have at this facility. It's very, very cool. One of the very cool things they have down here. But anyway, the last 5 weeks you're in your first training squadron. And after those 5 weeks, you get your commission. You continue in that training squadron. I got my commission end of October 1970, and I finished that first training squadron in December of 1970.
Okay.
That's just your initial training, and you're doing navigation training, communications. You're actually flying the aircraft, and this and that and the other thing.
Right.
You also get your introduction to basic jet flying at that time. And it's primarily just to get you acclimated to the difference between a prop job, doing navigation training and communication and all that, to more high performance aircraft with ejection seats that's fully aerobatic and the whole deal. And you have a few hops in that. And then from there, I went to Glencoe, Georgia. There used to be a base there at Brunswick, Georgia. And since I was a backseater, I became a radar intercept officer. That was called radar intercept officer training. If you saw the movie Top Gun, I was Goose.
Gotcha.
I was the adult supervision in the aircraft. Okay? But anyway, basically what you're doing as a backseater is you're doing co-pilot duties, you're running the radar, you're doing the air-to-air intercept function, and you're operating the weapon systems, and you're doing primarily the communications. And you're backing up the pilot, the front seater, with everything he's doing. And so you're a team. And so consequently, you're learning all those things at Glencoe. Primarily, you're learning to run air-to-air radar, intercept radar, and you're flying low levels besides, a few low levels, and you're doing airways flights besides. But your primary focus is you're learning how to do air-to-air intercepts against another aircraft, because that's your primary responsibility as a jet fighter, to intercept bad guys. From there, that was about 10 weeks. Got my wings out of there, and now, now I've been in the Navy active duty a year. I got my wings almost a year to the day when I entered active duty in Pensacola, Florida. Now you go to advanced training in Phantoms. I came to Virginia Beach. I was stationed at Naval Air Station Oceana, and I was in Fighter Squadron 101. It was the Phantom Advanced Training Squadron at that time. And I was in that squadron. There were a couple of delays now and again for different things going on in the fleet, and them not being ready for you, or them getting behind in the squadron, or various things caused delays through your training. But I got there in July of 1971, and then I got to my first fleet squadron, Squadron 33, in May of 1972. So I was in advanced training in Phantoms for 10 months. So altogether, from the time I walked through the door in Pensacola, Florida, to the time I got to my first fleet squadron was almost 2 years.
Okay.
That's how much the training was.
Yeah.
And another kind of a side story relative to that, when I was a junior in high school, I remember reading a book about what it took to become a military pilot, in particular tactical pilot.
Right.
And what I was reading, I couldn't believe how much you had to go through. First of all, graduate high school, get a 4-year degree in college, preferably in a technical subject.
Right.
So then you had to go all through all this training till you finally got to your fleet unit. And I said, how can anybody do that? But I did it.
Yeah.
And you kind of look back and you pinch yourself.
Right.
And you just say to yourself, how did I do that? But you'd be amazed what you're capable of in hindsight.
What model F4?
Mostly J's.
Okay.
Mostly J's.
And what's the primary mission of that aircraft? Is it multi-use, or is it?
It's multi-use. It's actually a fighter bomber.
Okay.
But when the Phantom was originally built and designed, and the first ones came off the production line in 1958, and it's a fabulous aircraft. It still holds some of the records in speed and
Right.
time to climb the whole day. It was an unbelievable aircraft. It was designed as a high-altitude, high-speed interceptor
Okay.
because the primary purpose was going to be intercepting Soviet bombers, long-range bombers. So that's what its primary design purpose was. But it actually ended up being a multi-role aircraft. It was a great interceptor, and if you fought it correctly, using its advantages of primarily its power, it had
Right.
incredible power. You didn't get in a turning fight with it in dogfights. You didn't
Yeah.
want to get slow with it because you'd get hammered by MiGs. They could outturn you and you'd get bagged in a heartbeat. But if you used the right tactics with it, and this is not classified anymore, it was called slashing attacks. You kept the Phantom fast and you wouldn't get slow. If you wanted to do one really good turn with a MiG, you could,
Yeah.
and it would be a good turn. But if you didn't get your aircraft in a position to fire your weapon there, you hit the afterburners, you unloaded, and you brought your speed back up, and you extended, and then you'd pitch back into the fight. And you'd come back in and do another, it was called a slashing attack. And you also used the vertical a lot, because it had the thrust-to-weight ratio was very, very good in a Phantom. And so you could use the vertical, and most other aircraft couldn't climb with you. And so you used that to advantage, then you'd pitch back into the fight. If they went up with you, and they ran out of airspeed, what they're going to do is they're going to fall off, and then you do a reversal on them, and then you're at their 6 o'clock, and you just shoot them down with your heat-seeking missile.
Right.
So any aircraft that you fly, in a tactical aircraft, you use the advantages of your aircraft,
Yeah.
and you try to, obviously you should know the aircraft that you're fighting against. If you know the disadvantages of that, you try to force that aircraft into that regime where they're at a disadvantage, and then you use the advantages of your aircraft, and most times you're going to come out ahead. At least you're probably not going to get shot down.
Yeah.
So
What's the transition like to go from Phantoms to F-14s? I assume the Navy phased out Phantoms
they did.
in favor of the F-14.
I could have stayed in Phantoms,
Okay.
but they were drawing down on the Phantoms and making more Tomcat squadrons and building more Tomcats.
Okay.
So I knew for my career, if I was going to advance and possibly get a squadron, and I never did get a squadron, never became a commanding officer, that at some point in time, since the Phantom squadrons were going away,
Right.
I had to transition to Tomcats.
Okay.
And so I did transition to Tomcats, and an airframe is an airframe is an airframe. It's gonna perform differently. It's gonna have different thrust to weight ratios, and one of the big advantages about a Tomcat was its variable geometry wing. So you could get slow with that and get in a dogfight with it, and it would perform very, very well. You would not want to do that with a Phantom. Tomcat also, when you accelerate, you could use the vertical in a Tomcat. The problem with a Tomcat was it's a big aircraft. It's a huge airplane. And so in a dogfight, if you took it vertical, it was called a bogey gathering maneuver, because all the bad guys in that fight would see the Tomcat. You're not going to lose sight of a Tomcat in a dogfight because it was such a big airplane. So you kind of wanted to not do that in a dogfight, even in a simulated dogfight, because everybody's going to see, oh, there's the Tomcat.
Yeah.
And then your adversary, even in training, is going to jump on you. But to answer your question, the technological change from a Phantom to a Tomcat, particularly weapon systems and the radar, was like going from modern tactical aircraft to Star Wars capability. It was a quantum leap.
Yeah.
That aircraft was actually built around the weapon system. Yeah.
So as much as you like F4s, the F-14 is an upgrade.
Oh, it was a huge upgrade. I loved the Phantom. I never really fell in love with the Tomcat.
Yeah.
Really good aircraft, respected it. I didn't dislike it. I liked it a lot,
Yeah.
but I fell in love with the Phantom.
Right.
The Phantom looks mean from any angle, number one. Also extremely rugged aircraft. And the engines that were in it, the General Electric J79 GE-10s, were probably the most reliable, well-built turbojet engines ever made for tactical aircraft. Extremely strong engines. They could take a lot of battle damage, and they would get you back home.
Yeah.
Very, very good aircraft.
Yeah.
Extreme. The Tomcat engines that they had them in the first the early Tomcats, the F-14As, which is what I flew. The engines that were in them, the TF-30s that were made by Pratt Whitney, they were good engines, but they were in the wrong airframe.
Yeah.
They were not really compatible. So consequently, they had a lot of compressor stalls all the time. You couldn't go full afterburner or full military to idle with them in any attitude regime in a dogfight, because if you did, you're probably going to get a compressor stall. You're going to get disruption of the air at the compressor face, at the intake of the engine. And so compressor stalls, you're going to hear them in an aircraft because it sounds like somebody's throwing hand grenades down your intake.
Yeah.
Bang, bang. And engines don't like air disruption coming through. Phantom, you can go full afterburner or full mil to idle in any flight regime. I don't recall getting ever a compressor stall in a Phantom, maybe once.
Right.
It was that strong and good of an engine, but it was also compatible with the airframe.
Yeah.
The TF-30 and the Tomcat was not compatible with the airframe, so they had problems with them.
Yeah.
I had that one experience with the aircraft engine on fire and landing at single engine, and it was very exciting. The later engines that the Tomcats got, the GE F-110 engine, superb engine. Very, very powerful, way more powerful than the TF-30s that were originally in them, and very reliable as well. The thrust-to-weight ratio was phenomenal. They could take off in full military and accelerate going uphill without using afterburner.
Wow.
Also, comparing the Phantom to the Tomcat, the thrust that the Phantoms had in full afterburner, they had 3 zones of afterburner. Tomcat had 5 zones of afterburner.
Okay.
The Tomcat was 10,000 pounds heavier than a Phantom, but in full afterburner, they had the same amount of thrust. Because the Tomcat engines were detuned to keep them more reliable and to have for maintenance purposes and flight hours wise, etc. So the Phantom, when the first Tomcats came out, the Phantoms, being a lighter aircraft with the same amount of thrust coming out of the engines, was actually faster than Tomcats. Most people don't realize that, but they were. Phantom was very fast.
When you're in Grenada and Lebanon, are you flying off a carrier both
Yes.
those operations?
Yes, I never was shore-based.
Okay.
In a fleet squad on the left. We were here at Oceana between deployments.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. It was USS Independence both times, both Grenada and Lebanon.
Okay.
Yep. CV-62.
And both in F-14.
Both in
Both
F-14s.
those-
Both was always in F-14s. Yes. Yeah.
Your most memorable moment would be landing with one engine on fire.
Yes.
If you had a big, even over combat.
Yes.
Being shot at.
Yes. Yes. There's nothing. We're the only crews. The guy was flying with it, and we're the only crews to ever do it. To ever land a Tomcat aboard the boat, single engine at night, and on top of it, we were on fire. Besides, we're the only ones ever to do that.
Right.
So,
Was there any thought when that's happening that from the commanders or anything to say, look, don't bring that airplane on board?
here's
Watch out and we'll get you?
here's actually the sequence. I had seen other Tomcats on fire with engine fires before
Okay.
landing on the ship, and they were on fire before they landed. And I knew the approximate amount of time if the fire was really bad and it got to certain areas of the engine bay.
Okay.
The amount of time you would have before you're going to be ejecting. I fully expected to be ejecting that night.
Right.
And so we actually had the engine fire light come on right after probably within 5 minutes after we took off from the ship.
Okay.
We were in the process of rendezvousing on an airborne tanker, which is pretty standard procedure for fighters, because you always want to keep fighters topped off with fuel, because if they have to respond to a situation where they have to intercept another aircraft, they're going to use a lot more fuel. So you always want to keep them topped off, just in case.
Yeah.
So we're in the process of rendezvousing on the tanker, and one of our engine fire lights comes on, which is never a good thing. It's always, that's an attention getter. So anyway, I'll kind of get to the answer to your question. we had to dump down the max landing weight because you just can't say, okay, we have to talk to the tower, the air boss, say, declared emergency, we got an engine fire light come on. And he literally said, do you need an emergency pull forward? Because fighters usually launch first on a launch, on a multi-plane evolution launch. And because their primary purpose is to defend the ship.
Yeah.
And so they launch first, so the launch has basically just started while we're rendezvousing on this tanker.
Yeah.
Declared emergency, engine fire lights on, the air boss says, do you need an emergency pull forward? So I knew we had to dump down the max landing weight, and it would take us multiple minutes to do that, so there's no reason to have emergency pull forward to scrub the launch, because that's what they would have to do.
Yeah.
So I said, no, boss. I said, we're going to dump down the max landing weight anyway, so just continue with the launch. Roger that.
Right.
So we're dumping down, and we're going through our procedures to try to resolve it, get the fire light to go out, and it went out initially when it came back to idle on that engine, and then it came back on, and got some secondary indications verifying that there was a problem in the engine bay.
Right.
And so then the procedure is to shut the engine down. The next procedure after that is you got secondary indications and the fire light stays on. The next step in the procedure is to eject.
Okay.
But you're flying a $45 million taxpayer asset. You're wearing wings, which shows that you make good decisions. And most importantly, the airplane is still flying.
Right.
You're wearing 85 pounds of flight gear. You're literally over shark-infested waters, because this was in the Caribbean op area where we did a lot of our training.
Yeah.
And so you don't really want to jump out of your nice, warm, dry airplane and hope that your ejection seat works, and hope that your parachute works, and hope that your flotation works, because you're wearing 85 pounds of flight gear.
So essentially, you're ceding control when you punch out. At least if you're in the aircraft flying it, you've got some kind of control.
As long as the aircraft is still responding to inputs,
Right.
it's still flying.
Right.
When it stops doing that, you give it back to the taxpayers.
Gotcha.
Because if you are putting controls in, inputs to the controls, and it's not responding accordingly,
Right.
you're along for the ride. And now it's time to get out before it does something really weird, and then you could be out of the ejection seat envelope, and
Gotcha.
you're going to die.
Yeah.
You're going to break your neck or something along those lines. And so consequently, it's up to us to decide when we're going to eject with minor circumstances, which
Right.
do come up later on.
Yeah.
So we come on in, and we dumping down, and they sequence us on in to come on and land. And we get to max landing weight, which actually the video that's on YouTube is called max trap. It's max landing weight. You don't want to be above that, because if you're too heavy, when your hook grabs a wire, the wire plays out, and the wire probably is going to break, or your hook point's going to come off, and then you're going to be below flying speed, and then you're going to drive off the end of the angle deck, and then you better eject, because you don't want to be in that airplane when it goes in the water, because you're dead. The ship's going to run over you, or you're going to drown, or whatever. A lot of bad things can happen. But anyway, so we come in, we're on final, and that's when we get the maximum landing weight. And we still have some residual fuel coming out of the dump mast behind the airplane.
Right.
And it's atomizing. It's just not good. And we still got this engine fire light on, and we got the secondary. We're single engine. And we come on in, and they only, ordinarily, an aircraft carrier has 4 cross-deck pennants. They are the cables that the hook grabs to stop the airplane.
Okay.
Usually the target wire is the 3-wire. There's nothing wrong with the 1-wire, there's nothing wrong with the 2-wire, but those are closer to the back of the ship. You know, if you get too close to the back of the ship, you hit the back of the ship, and then bad things happen too. It's called a ramp strike.
Yeah.
And so we're coming in. They only work in 2 wires that night. One was pulled because it only can take so many hits before they have to replace it. And the other arresting gear engine below decks they were actually doing maintenance on. So they only had 2 wires strung at that time. So we coming on in, and we got a pretty good start. And you don't want to start settling. You don't want to get under par because you're single engine. Bad things can happen. And so the LSO sees that where our hook is going to touch down is going to be on the deck where there's not a wire. And he anticipates that.
Yeah.
And we're going to bolt her. Okay? It's called a bolter. It's not a big deal most times because when you land on an aircraft carrier, you go to full power anyway. You don't go to afterburner if you get afterburners. You go to full military power,
right,
which is 100% power. Because you do that because if you don't grab a wire, you want to have flying speed.
Yeah.
So you just take off again, you get back in the pattern, they work you back in, and you come around, give it another try. So anyway, we're coming in, and he sees we're going to bolt it. We're going to miss a wire. So just before we touch down, he says power and go, which means put the power on now, anticipate it, and then hold your attitude and fly it away from the ship, and they'll give you the downwind turn
right,
from the approach controller. Because it's at night. We're not doing this visually. It's not a visual approach. And so, but we're still got some fuel, residual fuel coming out of the dump mast.
okay,
In either one, we tapped afterburner just a little bit, or the sparks from the hook going across the deck ignited this residual fuel coming out the dump mast.
right,
And it ignites and it explodes. And as our airplane is clearing the angle deck, on the radio you can hear people saying, "You're on fire, eject, eject." Now, number one, they're not telling me something that I don't already know,
right,
because the whole sky lit up
yeah,
like a bomb had gone. I thought the back of the airplane had just exploded. I thought, okay, reach for the handle, and I was reaching for the handle and ready to punch us both out. But I realized, and if I initiate it, the other guy's going to go also
yeah,
right after I do.
yeah,
And so it's called command eject. And so, but the reason why I didn't do it, I realized this airplane is still flying. It's not coming apart. It's not rolling. You know, I'm not feeling heat behind me.
yeah,
So this airplane is still flying. So I figured, well, I'm not going to eject this. And it was my job to eject this in the event we had
yeah,
to go. This guy's yelling at us, and I'm ready to eject, you're on fire. This airplane is still flying. You don't jump out of an airplane that's still flying.
right,
You got a better option.
yeah,
So we stay with it, and somebody on the radio says, check your dumps off. Well, they were off, but there was still residual fuel coming out the back, because we literally just turned them off. And so they turned us downwind, and we still got the firelight, and we still got everything else going on. And the good thing was the engine that was shut down, that was on fire, was the right engine, the starboard engine. And when you're turning downwind, you're turning left. You'd never want to turn into a dead engine.
right,
Never. If that had been the left engine, we would have extended straight ahead, we would have climbed on out and then turned downwind, because you don't turn into a dead engine, particularly when you're slow, because you'll get below flying speed, you'll depart control flight, you'll stall, and then you're close to the water. The flight deck's only 70 feet above the water.
yeah,
You're that close. And the other reason why I didn't eject, to go back to that, is a lot of bad things can happen if you eject near the ship.
right,
If your ejection seat doesn't work right, you're dead. You're gonna go down. You're gonna
right,
die. If you eject and everything works right, if you're in front of the ship could run over you. You could get tangled up in your parachute and you can drown. If your flotation doesn't work, you're wearing 85 pounds of flight gear, you better start getting rid of it now.
yeah,
I don't care if it's platinum bars. It's not going to do you any good if you're on the bottom of the ocean.
right,
You could also land on the flight deck with his aircraft engines turning, jet intakes and propellers, and you can end up, even if you don't hit any of those, the flight deck's made out of steel, you're going to get hurt. And so a lot of bad things could happen. But the biggest thing that went through my brain was the fact that this aircraft is still flying.
yeah,
Stay with it. So they turned us downwind. The left engine was good. We get downwind, we get back in the pattern, we bring that airplane around, we shoot another approach, and we land it, and we save the aircraft.
wow. Did
Yeah.
you ever find out what the reason for the fire was? Or
Yes.
Were the engine troubles at FOD or anything like that? Or?
Actually, what it was, and it's a very good question, it was not a big conflagration back there. What happened was, where an aircraft gets its air to operate the air conditioning system and pressurization, etc., is off one of the stages of the compressor of the engine. That's where this air comes off. Well, it comes off at that point. That is 600 degree Fahrenheit air. It's very, very hot air. If you touch it to your skin, you're fried. You're just fried.
Right.
And there was a leak right there that a sensor detected. It was a leak from that part of the engine.
Okay.
It was not a conflagration. Had we stayed airborne much longer, it would have been.
Yeah.
And so declared the emergency because all the indications said you got to get this sucker on the deck now. So we did, and so they fixed that. They changed the sensor. That aircraft was flying the next day.
Wow.
If we had ejected, it would have been gone. It would have been gone. So we did the right thing.
How do you think your experiences, military experience, particularly any of your combat experience, how do you think it's affected your life that you have time to look back on?
I'm not the same as I was before it. That's actually another experience that I'll never forget. It wasn't combat related, but it was relative to an act of terrorism that occurred on my second deployment in VF-33. It was TWA flight 841, and it was in, I want to say September or August or September of 1974. This was a Boeing 707, originated out of Tel Aviv. Ultimate destination was going to be JFK in New York. It had scheduled intermediate stops in Athens and then in Rome, and then it was going to go on to JFK. Unfortunately, and it had 88 passengers and crew aboard. Originated out of Tel Aviv, made the intermediate stop in Athens, and that's where a bomb was placed on the aircraft.
Okay.
And it was over the Ionian Sea at about 33,000 feet. The bomb went off, and the airplane, the wreckage and debris tumbled to the Ionian Sea from 33,000 feet, and everybody aboard died. And the first ship on scene was the USS Independence. And we spent the next 3 or 4 days and 3 or 4 nights on scene there, recovering bodies, body parts, and aircraft wreckage.
Yeah.
And it's something I'll never forget as long as I live. And what's interesting is they figured out who the mastermind was of that. His name was Abu Nidal. He was the guy who actually Ollie North mentioned in the Iran-Contra hearing testimony as to one of the real bad guys that he had to pay attention to for the security of his own family.
Yeah.
He mentioned that during those hearings. Also, Abu Nidal was the mastermind of the Achille Lauro hijacking in the Mediterranean. He was an ocean liner in the 80s where Leon Klinghoffer was killed by him, shoved over the side because he was in a wheelchair. And I don't know that he killed anybody else on that ship, but this was a very bad guy.
Yeah.
And they figured the Israelis finally whacked him in Syria in the late 80s or early 90s. But I'll never forget that. It was like a scene out of the Twilight Zone. When you're on scene at a crash scene, and later in my career I got into the safety business, and I investigated a lot of aircraft accidents. Military calls them mishaps. So I've seen bodies and body parts since then, but not one where you had children aboard and bodies and body parts and aircraft wreckage. That's something you never forget. And that will change you.
Yeah.
That will change who you are. It hardens you. It makes you probably a little more calloused. I won't say I have PTSD, because I probably don't. But it makes you a different person.
Yeah.
It does make, and also, tragically, the number of friends I had killed. In my not to dwell on the negative again, but in my last 4 months in training in Phantoms, I had 6 friends get killed. Right here close to this base. It was in the early 70s. We were doing a lot of things we shouldn't have been doing, probably. And there were junior guys, and they got killed.
Yeah.
They got killed. And the first few times that happens to you, and they're friends of yours or acquaintances of yours in the squadron or in other squadrons, that has an impact.
Yeah.
And that's when you realize, gee, I guess the reason why they're giving me flight pay is Not because I'm good looking or because they like me. It's because I've signed up for a hazardous business. But also, the part of that is that's what part of it makes it fun. I have that kind of personality.
Right.
Most guys that do that, they have that in their personality. Things that are exciting and that are risky are more fun. Because if they weren't exciting and had some degree of risk to them, anybody could do them
Right.
without consequence.
Right.
And if anybody can do them, what's the challenge in that?
Yeah.
I've driven race cars. I've been through 3 professional race driving schools. I used to be a snow skier till my knees went bad. I'm a certified scuba diver.
Yeah.
I like to shoot weapons, firearms. There's a pattern there.
Yeah, yeah.
There's a pattern there. I'm kind of a adrenaline junkie to some degree.
Right.
So nothing wrong with that.
Yeah.
I would do it all again in a heartbeat. It was great.
Is there any message you'd like to pass on to future generations who might see this video?
Serve your country in whatever way you can. You won't regret it because you live and you were born in the finest country, the greatest country in the history of the world. There's no other country like it.
Yeah.
And the things I have going for me in my life and my successes that I've had in my life. Number one, I was born in the greatest country in the history of the world, history of mankind, with a halfway decent brain and a fairly healthy body to 2 wonderful parents. And if you serve your country, I don't like the term pay, you're paying back, you're paying forward to the next generation. And you're showing that gratitude to what your country has done for you and will continue to do.
Right. Well, sir, on behalf of the American Wartime Museum, I want to thank you for taking time to tell us your story.
My pleasure.
I want to thank you for your service to your country.
I appreciate it.
And I want to present you with one of our challenge coins, just a little memento.
Outstanding. I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you.
Good deal. My pleasure.